Good morning. I'm Margaret Jackson, the director of the Freedom Center here in the School of Criminology at Simon Fraser University. And I'll be ably assisted today by Dr. Sarah Yursich, an associate director of the center, and as well with Abdul Zahir from the Civic Innovation Lab. But before starting, we would like to respectfully acknowledge that SFU is on the unceded Coast Salish territory, the traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, Coquitlam, Simiamu, and Katsi First Nations. So welcome. We're very pleased to be hosting our webinar today on gender-based violence in rural and remote settings in Ontario and BC, experiences, challenges, and services available for women. And this is really one of a series of webinars and learning briefs being funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada and partnered with the Alliance of Centres across Canada who have been undertaking the project, which has as its focus supporting the health of survivors of family violence and family law proceedings. The format for today is to have our two presenters, Dr. Danielle Bader and Dr. Jacqueline, each speaking separately, one after another for about 25 minutes or so, followed by a question period. So the questions will be held in the chat box, and after both presenters finish, we can then open it to questions from that box, which will be monitored by Dr. Yursich. And just to let you know, the session will be recorded and transcripts taken. So I'm going to start. I'm going to start now and introduce Dr. Danielle Bader. And she is a research analyst in the Health Analysis Division of StatsCan. She earned her Ph.D. in Sociological Criminology and MA in Criminology and Criminal Justice Policy from the University of Guelph. Her dissertation, which she's going to be focusing on today, employed a qualitative research designed to understand women's experience of intimate partner violence in non-urban communities in Ontario and service providers' perspectives, supporting individuals and families. So over to you, Dr. Bader. Hello, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen here. Can you see my screen now?
No.
No.
There we go. There you go. There you go.
All right. So thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much everyone for joining us. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge I'm in Ottawa, Ontario. I'm a guest of the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people who've inhabited and cared for these lands for millennia. I was really humbled to be invited to present my dissertation research that I conducted at the University of Guelph. Sorry, I'm trying to. I defended my dissertation nearly a year ago, and so it was really a labor of love. And I just want to be clear that this research has no connection to the work I'm currently doing at Statistics Canada, nor am I representing the agency. Don't know why my slides aren't moving. So here's an overview of what I'll be covering in my presentation. So I'll start by discussing the research context and the theoretical framework employed. Next, I'll outline the research questions and the methodology that guided my research. I'll then shift to presenting the findings and discuss their implications. And this will be followed by acknowledging some limitations, highlighting some contributions of my work, and concluding with directions for future research. So through my role as a research assistant on the Canadian Domestic Homicide Prevention Initiative with vulnerable populations, this was when I was exposed to the plight of non-urban women experiencing intimate partner violence and the need for research on this topic. On September 22nd, 2015, Basil Barutsky killed 3 ex-intimate partners, Anastasia Kuzik, Natalie Warmerdam, and Carol Clutton. These women were killed in the span of less than 2 hours in Wilno, Ontario. And the death of these 3 women garnered political attention. And so in 2016, the provincial government committed $1 million over 2 years to what they called the Rural Realities Fund. And the purpose of this was to address gender-based violence and inequitable service provision in non-urban communities in Ontario. Barutsky was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 70 years. And this was for 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. And it's through this presentation, I will demonstrate how the geographic environment influences and contributes to the risk of intimate partner violence and homicide for women in these communities, and the importance of accounting for the role of geography to increase safety for these women. So my research embraces theoretical pluralism in an effort to acknowledge and integrate strengths from multiple disciplines, including sociology, psychology, feminist studies, and geography, to demonstrate how intimate partner violence in non-urban communities is relational, interactional, and has spatial consequences. So I won't be covering the individual papers from my dissertation, but I developed this diagram to explain the role that theory played in the work that I conducted. So for the first study, I used emotional geography to examine how women's feelings and perceptions of fear and safety are interconnected with places in non-urban settings. So emotional geography aims to understand how internal feelings are expressed externally, and subsequently how they influence human behavior and social interaction in relation to place, but also how emotions are co-constituting in the sense that they influence and are influenced by physical landscapes, materiality, and social orders. So an example of this is a woman driving 10 minutes out of her way to avoid driving down a road that a previous incident of violence occurred. And so for my second paper, I use intersectionality and social ecology to examine how women's social identities and the geographic environment influence their experiences of violence and the strategies that they employ to stay safer. So intersectionality examines how multiple and intersecting social identities overlap and produce relative positions of privilege and oppression, and how this shapes a women's lived experiences. And then social ecology is a lens for explaining how factors present at multiple levels, so the microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem, and macrosystem of the environment interact and contribute to the occurrence of complex social phenomenon, such as intimate partner violence. So really, social ecology examines how the environmental context contributes to the occurrence of the social problems, not focusing on the actual occurrence of the problem itself. And so in my third study, I used social ecology to examine how the non-urban environment influenced the challenges experienced by service providers responding to intimate partner violence and developing safety plans. So 4 key research questions guided my work. So first, how do non-urban women experiencing intimate partner violence feel safe? Second, how do women living in non-urban communities protect themselves from violence perpetrated by an intimate partner? Third, what challenges do service providers encounter when developing safety plans with women living in non-urban communities experiencing intimate partner violence? And finally, how do women and service providers' perspectives align on how to increase safety in non-urban communities? So data were collected from 2 research sites, one in Northern Ontario and one in Eastern Ontario. And I conducted 20 face-to-face semi-structured interviews with white and First Nations adult women who experienced intimate partner violence and lived in one of these communities. I spent roughly 2 to 3 weeks in the communities, and I had lengthy informal conversations with service providers to learn more about the community and the women that they worked with. So here's a snapshot of the participants that I interviewed. So the majority of women identified as white and 6 women identified as white or white and First Nation. The women ranged in age between 19 and 64, but the vast majority were between 35 and 54. Half of the women completed post-secondary education. And the vast majority of women had children. However, not all women had their children in their care. So it was notable that the First Nations women, approximately 2/3, had their children apprehended, whereas all the white mothers with dependent children had their children in their care. And so interviews with women were used to answer the first and second research question. And then I also conducted 8 semi-structured interviews by phone with service providers who worked in the study sites and developed safety plans with women. So participants worked across various sectors, including violence against women, victim services, counseling services, addictions, an Indigenous organization, and that is it. They had varying years of experience ranging between 1 and 30 years. And so these interviews were used to answer the third research question. And then to answer the fourth research question, I use interviews from women, but also service providers. So now to answer the research questions, in response to the first question, the findings revealed that safety is a multi-dimensional concept encompassing spatial, mental, physical, social, and cultural elements. So when asked what made women feel safe, different pictures emerged, revealing the need for a multi-dimensional understanding. So for Donna, she says, I rarely fully feel safe, but my family and I went to Florida this summer. And because I don't think he has any connections in Florida, I felt safe there and my step was lighter. My whole body kind of felt lighter. I was happier. I could breathe less on my mind. And then Joanne says, safety is a place where you feel comfortable. Safety is a place where you feel loved, where you're protected, where you're secure, where you don't have to worry. Support may be a phone call away, and it's important in order to make those crucial steps forward. And then we see different, we see the responses by First Nations women are a little bit different. And so Jules says, being around my kids and being at home, they just keep you going. When things get too bad, they usually just give me a hug and say, I love you. And then Mare shares, I'm starting to see and reach out more. Like this morning, Family and Children's Services messaged me. She offered me some lunch snacks for the boys. I'm like, yeah, sweet snacks. I don't have my ex-partner here telling me or anybody telling me that if I do that, I'm less of a mom. I'm going to have my kids taken because I can't feed them. So in general, there's been a greater emphasis on women's physical safety when developing a safety plan. And although service providers are knowledgeable about current standards of practice and support a comprehensive approach to safety planning, it's really critical to expand these discussions because the tools that are available online and that are used by shelters, and also the way that intimate partner violence has been conceptualized in the research, typically focuses on the risk of physical assault. And so as a result, safety planning and service provision often fail to capture and address the range of risks that women experience in the context of intimate partner violence. In response to the second question, women shared that they primarily employed strategies to reduce physical danger, and this is consistent with the first research question. So for example, one woman told me that she bought a rope ladder to create a second exit out of her home. Women talked about removing firearms from the home, having police confiscate them in some situations. One woman installed a double-sided keyhole lock in her front door so that if the abuser tried to break and enter, he wouldn't be able to unlock with the lock on the inside. So in this sense, women's strategies align with a legal response to intimate partner violence, which focuses largely on crimes against the person. So how women responded to abuse reflects how intimate partner violence is characterized and understood through discourse and representations, particularly in criminal law. So the findings support employing a comprehensive protection-centered approach that focuses on women's mental, physical, financial, social, and cultural well-being. And secondly, strategies employed by women in response to intimate partner violence were heavily influenced by the environmental context in which they were living. So women primarily relied on private strategies, which are placating and resistance. So placating refers to strategies where women would do things to keep the abuser content and nonviolent. So that could look like making sure there's a hot meal ready when he gets home from work, for example, making sure the house is spotless. And then resistance, this could, it doesn't need to be physically fighting back, but more less dire cases of fighting back, or more mute, I guess. And this was primarily due to limited access to social services and transportation in the communities. And so the following quote demonstrates the dire situation for women in these communities. So Candace explains that she feels alone and isolated and responsible for protecting herself and her children. She says, "When you've had a blow up with a partner, you don't feel safe in your own home. There's nowhere to go. You can talk to someone, but they're an hour away. There's like no one in little towns that can even take a person for a night just to get away from it. So you just kind of like sleep and hope and pray to God that everything is peaceful for the next morning, that you can actually go." So the failure to provide equitable access to social and emergency services and public transportation suggests that current policies are imposing responsibilization on women who are living in these communities, experiencing intimate partner violence, and forcing them to take responsibility for managing their risks and safety under neoliberal thinking. Responsibilization is interpreted by feminist scholars and advocates as a passive strategy employed by the government, perpetuating marginalization and social inequality of women experiencing intimate partner violence. So in response to the third research question, essentially service providers are doing their best, but their hands are tied. So women's access to personal resources such as adequate personal income, stable and affordable housing, and access to transportation were among the greatest needs, compromising their safety and making safety planning difficult. So one service provider shared, "So when we're trying to do safety planning or trying to provide resources, even around basic needs, before we can even do some of the clinical work, we've run into a lot of limited resources. I think a big part of what we still need to do as far as providing safety for women in the community, it really goes back to if we're not meeting people's basic needs, like, affordable housing that's safe and immediate, safety planning is very difficult." So really, it's really important to address these basic needs before service providers can get to the clinical work and dealing with more complex issues in women's lives, such as intimate partner violence. And so service providers were able to offer women gift cards for groceries and gas through their agency, but this was really a short-term solution. And so service providers expressed feeling helpless when developing safety plans with some women because they reached a point where they exhausted all possible options and women still remained in danger. And service providers also talked extensively about how the legal system compromised women's safety. So they talked about how the police failed to intervene in some cases and enforce court orders. So restraining orders, peace bonds, child apprehensions. In addition, judges and justices of the peace minimized women's experiences of violence, blamed women for the abuse, released abusers quickly with minor consequences, and this allowed abusers to repeat their behavior. So one service provider shares, "Our justice of the peace, who is a woman, she just keeps letting everybody go. She says, 'Oh, I know you. Your wife is making a big deal out of this, so we'll just take your guns away and you just stay away from her. And you guys just need to work on this.' No, that's not appropriate, right? And then the police aren't taking it seriously. And then we end up having to manage the fear and everything else that comes with it, right?" So police and judges may be apprehensive about intervening in intimate partner violence in these communities because it's still perceived to be a private matter, or because they're upholding traditional conservative norms and patriarchal domination within the family and the community more broadly. So this finding is particularly concerning because women's interactions with police officers and judges in court are crucial because they impact whether they will seek intervention in the future. And also because of the limited availability of social services, police often provide crisis support and intervention in these communities. And they are in fact a frequent contact for women in non-urban communities who are experiencing intimate partner violence. And moving on to the last research question. So there were 3 key points of agreement. So women living below the poverty line represents a significant challenge in these communities. So as I mentioned, women were living in extreme poverty. Many women, it was difficult for them to meet basic needs. Some of them didn't have cell phones, some women didn't have internet access. And although poverty is not unique for women in non-urban communities, research demonstrates that being a woman in a non-urban community is associated with living in poverty. So overall, interviews with women and service providers suggest that a rural-specific poverty reduction strategy is needed that addresses the unique circumstances and needs of women in need of protection. Interviews with women and service providers illuminated how geographic isolation coupled with poverty left women in a precarious position with limited access to transportation and social services. So this is evidence of structural intersectionality, which reveals how seemingly neutral institutional practices and policies have differential impacts and reproduce broader inequalities. So because non-urban communities have small populations and low population density and dispersion, the cost per capita to provide social services, for example, is greater compared to urban centers. And so in this way, non-urban communities are disadvantaged because urban and market-based models of efficiency are employed to evaluate and assess funding needs that are not responsive to the geographic context in which agencies are operating. And so these models of efficiency are used to downsize and rationalize shutting down services and redirecting funds to urban centers to serve a greater number of people. So as one participant put it, the government needs to attach dollars to distance in the funding formula for organizations in non-urban communities to increase safety for these women. And finally, both women and service providers talked extensively about the inadequate police response and how the police can be dangerous and even escalate violence for women who are experiencing violence by a partner, and specifically for Indigenous women. So some women in high-risk situations felt protected by the police, but this was short-lived, and women were responsible for their own safety after some time had passed. And so for other women, particularly First Nations women, they actually avoided calling the police. So my findings support redirecting public funds towards prevention efforts and addressing victims and survivors, abusers, children, and community needs through social services rather than policing. And finally, there were 2 key points of disagreement between women's and service providers. So women in my study disclosed that their abusers, many of them had access to a firearm and it was used to threaten or intimidate them, but there was limited discussion with service providers about firearms. And so the reason for this discrepancy might be because non-urban communities are associated with a positive gun culture. So some women told me that they were hunters and they didn't think about the abuser using a gun against them. Or in some situations, they were afraid or embarrassed to disclose that a gun was involved in the violence against them, perpetrated against them. So these findings demonstrate the importance of addressing firearm safety, specifically when safety planning with women in non-urban communities. And this might involve educating women about the potential risk associated with storing firearms in the home, as well as strategies to delay use of a firearm. So for example, storing ammunition separately from the firearm, having a trigger lock, etc. And finally, the historical and ongoing impact of colonization on First Nations women was very evident in those that I spoke to. And this manifested as living in extreme poverty, having their children apprehended, low educational attainment, financial dependence on the abuser, being unhoused, difficulty meeting basic needs, struggling with addictions and complex trauma. Yet colonization was rarely mentioned or acknowledged by service providers. And the reason for this discrepancy might be that none of the service providers identified as Indigenous, and some of them worked with Indigenous women infrequently. But regardless, this is problematic because social services that work with women who are experiencing intimate partner violence are commonly developed and delivered by non-Indigenous individuals who employ a Western worldview that supports individualism. whereas an Indigenous worldview aligns more closely with collectivism. So this means that safety is inclusive of not just the woman and children, but also the family and the local community more broadly. So safety plans that focus only on the woman and children in her care may actually be inappropriate for Indigenous women without recognition of these differences. So there needs to be more education for service providers on the ongoing impact of colonization for Indigenous women and how that impacts their lived experiences. So now I just want to acknowledge some limitations. So firstly, the majority of women in the study were white. However, First Nations women were overrepresented in the sample relative to their representation in the study sites. Secondly, some populations are not represented, so specifically women who own farms, for example, as well as those who identify as a member of a religious community, and they would have unique experiences that are different than those that I spoke to. Third, the findings are based on a small sample of service providers, and this is attributable to being overworked and under-resourced, potential fear of identification, and also the rise in intimate partner violence during COVID. We know that there was a shadow pandemic that happened, and this put a heavier demand on the violence against women sector. And finally, there's no representation from legal actors, and this would have been very useful given the documented evidence about how they failed to protect women. So despite the limitations, my research makes important contributions to understanding intimate partner violence in non-urban communities, particularly in the Canadian context. So this here is the social ecological model displayed as nested circles developed by Heiss in the late 1990s. And this has commonly been used to explain the occurrence of intimate partner violence, but I argue it actually falls short of accounting for the role of geography. So my research demonstrates that geography is intertwined with risk factors at all levels within the environment, suggesting it's a spider web-like diagram that's more appropriate for displaying how geographic isolation permeates women's experiences and responses to intimate partner violence and challenges faced by service providers responding to intimate partner violence in non-urban communities. So just consider this scenario. A woman wants to leave her abuser. She's working in a low-wage job and she doesn't earn enough money to move out on her own with her 2 kids. The community is attracting individuals to work, driving up the cost and decreasing supply of rental housing, and landlords are pricing out low-income individuals. She goes on the wait list for subsidized housing, and it can take anywhere between 3 months to a couple years. And the only other place she can go is the shelter. But the shelter is too far for her kids to remain at the same school, and it's too far for her to travel to work every day. Her abuser has a drug addiction and threatened her with a gun in the past while under the influence. And although he's prohibited from possessing firearms, his guns are being stored with his parents in their home nearby. So in this scenario, a woman's socioeconomic status is located here within the microsystem, but then the other factors are located within the exosystem, so the housing market and the local economy. And this is what makes it very difficult for her to move out on her own and separate from her abuser. I just want to add a caveat that I understand that separation isn't necessarily a safer option for women. All right. So some other contributions. Through my research, I developed a spatial understanding of fear and safety for women in non-urban communities. And my research demonstrates the fear of women, that fear of crime is not solely an urban phenomenon. Much of the existing research examining strategies women employ to increase their safety and service providers' perspectives are descriptive. However, I developed theoretical explanations drawing from emotional geography, social ecology, and intersectionality. And finally, geography has been a blind spot for intersectionality. However, my research demonstrates the importance of incorporating geography into intersectional analyses examining women's lived experiences. And overall, my research demonstrates the importance of using a place-based analysis to understand how geography is deeply entrenched in women's lives. So more specifically, future research on intimate partner violence and geography should employ theoretical frameworks that place geography at the forefront of analysis. There's also a need for research to highlight differences along the continuum of non-urban communities, so looking specifically at rural communities versus remote and northern, for example. And finally, studies should examine how geography intersects with different marginalized groups of women to understand their unique experiences, how they are responded to upon disclosure, and how they protect themselves from abusers. So I'm going to end my presentation here with a quote from one woman who I interviewed that demonstrates the consequences of non-physical violence and the need for holistic understanding of safety. I'd like to invite you to take a minute to read it quietly on your own. Thank you. And I will stop my presentation there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Bader. It's so important to have captured the women's voices and their experiences from both the women and to get the service providers' perspectives, which I think is very valuable to merge together to try to make meaning of all that is occurring. And clearly in those non-urban communities, which have unique and challenging issues for women in those situations, they do need to be addressed through the provision of services, obviously, for their safety and support. And I really appreciate your making a meaning, even theoretically, to try to understand this better. I like this idea of including now geographic intersectionality or that consideration as a factor. So I will use this to serve as a segue to my introduction of Dr. Jacqueline Holler's presentation entitled Violence, Mobility, and Services in Northern BC, Engaging Community Through Northern Fire. And Dr. Holler is professor of gender studies and history and coordinator of women's and gender studies at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George. And she's a member of the leadership team of UNBC's Northern Feminist Institute for Research and Evaluation, Northern Fire, which hosts the Women North Network, connecting women and agencies across Northern BC. So, Dr. Holler, over to you.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for that introduction. I'm just going to get my presentation up. Can you just let me know that if you can see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So thank you, everyone. As Margaret said, I'm a member of the leadership team of Northern Fire, and my presentation today is aimed at telling you about how Northern Fire engages with community to address the distinct issues involved in Northern BC, particularly as they regard gender-based violence in the region. So that's going to be the highlight of my presentation rather than any one project, except that I will talk quite a bit about our hitchhiking project as it relates to mobility, which is a key feature of addressing violence in the region. I'd like to begin by stating respectfully that I live and work upon the traditional territory of the Lheidli First Nation. The Lheidli are the people where the two rivers meet. That's what their name means. Prince George is situated at the confluence of the Fraser and Nechako rivers, and for thousands of years that has been the epicenter of the Lheidli homeland, and I'm grateful to be here. I'd also like to acknowledge funding, first of all, from the government of BC, also from the National Collaborating Centre for Aboriginal Health, now Indigenous Health, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And I would be remiss if I did not also thank the individuals and Indigenous nations throughout BC who've participated in my hitchhiking research. So Musicho to all of you. And I think we have a national audience, and I think it's probably relevant to start with talking about BC and about Northern BC's place within it. When I travel across Canada and I'm talking to folks about BC, this is the BC they often have in mind. So it's very common if I'm in Ottawa in the winter, they'll say, oh, you must be finding it really cold here, being from BC, because they're thinking about Southern BC. They're thinking about Vancouver or Victoria or the wine country of the Okanagan Valley very frequently. So that's the BC that many people have in mind. But there is another BC. I mean, BC is a very large place. It's over 900,000 square kilometers in area, which makes it only slightly smaller than France and Poland put together. And within the BC borders live over 5 million people. So, you know, it's a relatively populated province, but by global standards, a very sparsely populated place. And Southern BC constitutes about 40% of the province's territory, but contains 95% of its population. So if we were going to be pedantic, and I will be pedantic, we could say that Northern BC is a territory the size of France, but it has about a quarter of a percentage point of France's population in that region. So that really constrains and colors the nature of life in this region. So here's Northern BC and its overall area. So Northern BC is distinguished by a whole bunch of things, including its population, including its size, its harsh climate, relative to Southern BC. It's primarily boreal ecosystems, extremely low population density, large population of large mammal wildlife, and its relative masculinity and its larger Indigenous population. So this is where I'm situated. It doesn't look like this right now. There's not much green to be seen right now, but that was, I don't know where it went, but that was beautiful Prince George, BC, which is the gateway to the north. And you see it here as a red dot on the map of BC. So I mentioned that Northern BC's population density is lower. You can see that represented on the map on the left. I also mentioned that Northern BC is distinguished by its greater masculinity. So the population of BC is gendered in some interesting ways. And that Northern BC region, as you can see from the map on the right, is significantly more masculine than the rest of the province, with implications that we can consider. I don't have a map. There isn't a really good map that maps indigeneity onto British Columbia, but in general, Northern BC is much more Indigenous. In some regions, such as the North Coast region, the population is 60% Indigenous, and the lowest proportion of Indigenous people is in the Cariboo region with about 6%, which is still slightly higher than the provincial average. So those are just some of the ways that Northern BC is distinct. And Northern Fire really came into existence to address Northern realities for women. So Northern Fire is an independent research institute at UNBC. And as has already been said, I'm a member of the leadership team, which you see here. And it has a mandate and mission that really straddles the domains of research, advocacy, and knowledge transmission. So we're really engaged in multiple projects, and our focus is on community. So the history and mandate, I won't go over, but they're summarized here. Northern Fire has a lengthy history dating back to the establishment of Northern Fire as the Northern Secretariat of the BC Centre for Excellence for Women's Health. But in the last 2 decades, it's been a wholly independent institute at UNBC. And as I mentioned, it focuses very much on connecting women and community. And the hallmark of that is the Women North Project, now more than 2 decades in the past, which created the Women North Network as its fundamental outcome, because what we found at that time was that the northern factors affecting women's health included and were kind of surmounted by the substantial isolation that women feel in this region. So that's Northern Fire. These are just some of the past and current projects. I won't go over them, except that I will say over the past decade, our focus has moved to more and more interest in highlighting and addressing violence as a significant health issue for Northern women. And our most recent project and partnership in connection with Carrier-Sakani Family Services is an environmental scan of missing and murdered women and Indigenous girls prevention programs. So we are trying to occupy that space that's working with community to address violence in the North. So violence in Northern BC is a well-established reality. The association between Northern BC and violence is established in Canada and globally, principally because of the notoriety of the Highway of Tears, which has received significant attention over the past 2 decades. This has brought global attention to the region. As you see here, the New York Times has run several articles on the region. And it's brought global attention to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So the stereotype of the region as a region of violence is well established, not merely in Canada, but around the world. And to a significant degree, the stereotype of Northern British Columbia is borne out by statistics. So overall crime rates are higher in the region, as you see here. The BC average is indicated at the bottom in black, and the various regional districts of Northern BC are represented in the pink bars above. So these are total criminal code offenses. But when we turn to violent crime rates, we see that Northern BC is even more out of step with BC averages. I added Metro Vancouver to this list as well, because Metro Vancouver is currently undergoing a great deal of concern about violent crime. But as you can see here, violent offending in the North still outpaces the rates for Metro Vancouver. I don't know if this question just came up for me, but the PowerPoint will be shared as far as I'm concerned. So those are violent crime rates. I have no idea what's happening to my presentation. I'm sorry, but it just moved on its own. And it's proving very difficult to move it back. There we go. I don't have 2021 data for the sexual assault rates in the North because the report from the ministry did not, last year's report from the ministry did not break sexual assaults out. But these data, which relate to the period 2010 to 2015, so they're not annual, they're for that 5-year period. These data demonstrate the difference between Southern communities and Northern communities. And what I wanted to do with this is to highlight that this is not merely a rural-urban divide, because we have very small communities like Merritt, Campbell River, and Nelson on this chart. What this shows is that Northern communities, regardless of size, have a lot more police-reported sexual assault. And when we turn to all violence against women in the North, we see the same kind of thing. Again, I've included some Southern communities such as Summerland and Salt Spring Island and Nanaimo, which is generally seen as a rough place in BC, and Merritt. But again, what we see for virtually all of the Northern communities is that police-reported violence against women is higher in the region. So that's the context. And with that in mind as a background to the region and how it differs from Southern BC, I'd like to start by looking at mobility, again, very different from the South. So note, first of all, that this vast region, and it's 1,300 kilometers from Prince George to the Yukon border, this vast region is serviced by very few routes. There simply aren't roads because of the rugged geography of the region. And that makes a great deal of difference in terms of getting around and the possibility of getting from one place to another. We know from now 2 decades of research that mobility is linked to gender, and that both of those features, gender and mobility, interact with violence and service seeking. So we know, for example, that there are differences in transit use. We know that there are differences in car ownership, access, and use. We know there are differences in who rides as a passenger versus who drives, who walks, and then how transportation difficulties affect men and women differently. It's clear that violence and fear of violence constrain women's mobility in really important ways. And when we're thinking about service seeking and the ability to flee violence, this becomes a really important issue. We also know that Indigenous Canadians are distinct with regard to mobility. They're more mobile. They experience greater spatial distancing from services relative to non-Indigenous Canadians. We know that Indigenous women are particularly mobile and more likely to live off reserve and therefore to have more transportation needs. We know that Indigenous people are more likely to experience motor vehicle accidents, and in northern BC, that risk is even more exaggerated rather. And we know that Indigenous youth are more mobile than non-Indigenous youth and than older Indigenous people. What's more, Indigenous mobility is often viewed as illicit. So there are all kinds of intersectional qualities to analyzing mobility. And when we look at northern BC, what we can see clearly is that it's a region of automobility. That is, mobility in the region is heavily dependent upon the use of private automobiles. And the lack of public transportation in the region limits access to services, and it exacerbates vulnerabilities to violence. And this quote that you see here is, I think, an excellent summary of what it's like to have to depend on other people to ferry you around when you don't have a car. So this is an Indigenous research participant talking about, well, you know, there's a bus, but maybe the bus is too expensive. At the time this interview was done, there was still a Greyhound bus. But she also talks about driver's licensing, vehicle insurance, and the distance from town. An hour and a half from town is pretty good in our region, but what it means is that if you're getting a ride from someone, which is the only way to get there, you need to stockpile all of your trips, put them together, and do everything at once. And that's a very characteristic type of mobility in the region. So the UNBC hitchhiking study, which ran from 2012 to 2017, was really launched to investigate the link among hitchhiking, service seeking, and violence in northern BC. It was launched initially in fall 2012, and it was directly related to the Highway of Tears Symposium and some of the desired outcomes of that symposium. And it should be emphasized here, whenever I talk about it, I emphasize that it's not a crime-solving tool, but a tool for prevention, transportation safety, and understanding. So the data collection for this study included a GPS-based component to locate and map hitchhiking. It included an electronic survey and an interview instrument, and it included roadside anonymous information gathering and a media study focused on Prince George media alone. I'm sorry with this. I'm clicking as hard as I can, but will not advance my slides. There we go. So we have many findings, and obviously I don't have time to go through all of them, but I'd like to focus in particular on some key themes around danger and safety. So the northern highways in our research emerged as a space of danger. BC hikers' narratives of the north emphasized geographical distance, necessity, and danger from men, weather, and wildlife. And we found that even participants with a great deal of experience highlighted these dangers. So Jake, who was a 33-year-old Indigenous man, joked that he would like to know that if he was found dead up north, people would know who he was, because yeah, that's how it is up north. It's the Highway of Tears. Selena, who is a 37-year-old non-Indigenous woman, talked about how she had hitchhiked all over Canada, but she never went far north because of the safety issues. And Celeste, an Indigenous woman from the South who had to travel north, was told by a friend, you cannot go by yourself because you have to go through that highway. And Sandra, who lives in the north, emphasizes the dangers of transportation in the region, right? Weather, wildlife, lack of infrastructure, internet and cell service, and then of course the dangers of the roads themselves. Encounters with wildlife precipitated many fears among participants. So Lenore, who was a 31-year-old Indigenous woman, actually described escaping from the vehicle of a would-be assaulter and running into the bush. And she waited there for hours, but when she finally thought it was safe to leave, she found that there was a bear following her. And as she described here, it was quite terrifying. In the event, the bear proved less a threat than the man who had given her a ride, and Lenore was able to escape without incident. The masculine spaces, economies, and sociabilities of Northern BC appeared in many of the narratives as a source of fear. And this was true for both men and women hitchhikers. So both of the quotes that are here are actually from male hitchhikers. So Bradley, who was actually a Southern hitchhiker who had undertaken a trip to the north, mentioned that monster trucks scoot on by because the drivers feel superior, probably because of their incomes, to those who are hitchhiking and don't own vehicles. And below, Andrew, a 25-year-old First Nations man, described how he mastered his fear when he was picked up hitchhiking by two blood-covered men. So Northern masculine cultures of hunting, long commuting, resource extraction, and firearms ownership complicate mobility in transportation in the region and definitely play a role in perceptions of safety. And it should be mentioned that another aspect of Northern masculinities is the higher wage gap between men and women in the region. So relative to Southern BC, there's a much bigger wage gap caused by resource extraction and men's greater participation in that sector. And the implications of that for both transportation and violence are interesting to ponder. Long-haul truckers are a key feature of Northern BC roads and emerged in our research as a key feature of Northern narratives. For women seeking transportation through hitchhiking, there was a particular fear of long-haul truckers. So this is from Selena, an Indigenous woman who described how she was very frightened because of her experiences traveling. Another woman who completed an online questionnaire described being kidnapped by a trucker in Northern BC. He took her to Southern BC, where she was able to take advantage of the more crowded setting to escape. And another hitchhiker from the far north described how she had actually leapt out of the moving cab of a trucker because he wouldn't let her out, and she sustained minor injuries in that experience. Very few participants talked about distrust, fear, and hostility on the basis of race, but the only mentions that they got were in connection with the North and rural BC. Dave, a 33-year-old First Nations man, highlighted the racial tensions caused by resource extraction and the fact that Indigenous communities have signed onto the pipeline and now have, as he put it, have got pretty much first in line for jobs. Richard, who was a Southern hitchhiker, described a trip in the north. He was picked up by a driver who said, "You know why I picked you up?" And he said, "Well, because you're white, you're Caucasian." So clearly race does play into hostilities at least some of the time, although it wasn't a really strong theme in our interviews. And one of the key themes of our research was finding that hitchhiking started early. Our participants started in their teens and sometimes as early as 8 years old. This was particularly true in our study of Indigenous hitchhikers. So thinking about mobility in the North and thinking about the nature of these geographies, the sparse population, it's deeply concerning how many youth were hitchhiking at extremely tender ages. And the reasons they gave for doing so involved the usual, but I would highlight running away from bad situations or running away from home, because that's something that emerged from many of the interviews. So summing up and thinking about north-south differences, you know, I highlighted some of the stats about the differences of the North, but our hitchhikers told us that it was different too. So we heard about more roadside sexual assaults or intended sexual assaults. I think of these as geography facilitated. We did hear about more racism in the North. And we heard about the fear and vulnerability of simply being on a highway between two very distant points. And I should highlight that there are stretches of the highway where there are no communities of any size for 400 kilometers. So the North really emerges as a zone of fear and vulnerability when it comes to mobility and transportation. Thinking about service seeking, this is critical because services are concentrated in Prince George. So again, 1,300 kilometers from the Yukon border and about 800 kilometers from Prince Rupert. So some changes have been made in recent years to address this. Two governments have rolled out bus service between 2016 and 2018, first for Highway 16 and now for other routes as well. So BC Transit started offering transportation on the Highway of Tears in 2016, and then a broader BC bus service was launched for the North in 2018. And these bus services have limited hitchhiking north of Prince George, but they certainly have not addressed all of the service needs and transportation needs of people in the North. So the 5-point plan that was introduced in 2016 was for a whole bunch of things, including the expansion of transit, but also community grants, First Nations driver education, highway infrastructure, and cell coverage. There's been progress on the first point, but there's so much to be done, particularly in cell coverage and Wi-Fi. There are massive parts of the North that do not have cell coverage or Wi-Fi. And if you go even to Prince Rupert, you leave Prince George and very soon you're out of cell range. So when people are driving around, it's always, you know, please text me before you get out of cell range. That's obviously a pretty inadequate state of affairs for a major route. And transportation frequency is still, it's still so inadequate. So I'm currently a member of the steering committee for a BC Society of Transition Houses project aimed at increasing options, particularly for women fleeing violence. But what's emerged from that is that people are finding the transportation frequency hard to understand and really hard to deal with. It doesn't meet their needs. And finally, Northern Fire has been, as I said, paying increasing attention to violence. And so from 2018 on, we've been trying to highlight gendered violence and its interaction with all of these themes, such as transportation, and as I'll mention in a minute, housing. So we've hosted a number of symposia, and we get the feedback every time that we need connections to overcome the isolation of the North. At our major conference held in 2019, addressing sexual and domestic violence in Northern BC, we once again heard that, and we heard that we don't even know what resources exist in the North. Therefore, we have launched or about to launch a resource guide based on research conducted throughout the North to address the consistent feedback we received about the lack of connections and the isolation among service providers and women in the North. So we are really trying to offer a partial response, a one-stop shop, if you like, that brings together all of the community services and contacts within this massive region. We see this guide as a living document because what we found even in researching it is that agencies come and go, they lose their funding, etc. And new agencies and programs start more positively. So this, we hope, will be shared nationwide through our Northern Fire website. And we also hope at the advocacy level that it's going to highlight the massive regional gaps in services. So those are some of the projects that we've been involved in. And I'll end it there. But I do welcome your questions, and at Northern Fire, we welcome any and all contact requests. And you can join the Women North Network if you're interested in keeping up with Northern BC. I'll stop it there. Thank you so much.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. Actually, I want to first indicate to the attendees that they may enter their questions in the chat room now. But yes, I'm especially impressed with your resource guide, Dr. Holler. I think that that would be something that would be quite valuable to disseminate. And it's encouraging to find that there is such a network of connecting women to in the North with those needed services that can address the problems such as Dr. Bader has also indicated to us exist. But as well, I was impressed with the undertaking of the relevant research with the hitchhiking study. That's important to help us understand those challenges, that reality. I never fully appreciated the significance of the highway in that sense. And so it was great that you could present these issues again through the voices of those individuals. So thank you very much. And yes, we can certainly start with questions. Do we have questions? No open questions. Well, there we go. There we go. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Oh, yes. Jessica, should we read that? Yes, I have noticed that the experiences of immigrant women are not included in either of the presentations. I'm curious if either of the presenters have any thoughts on the experiences of immigrant women who are experiencing IPV in rural or remote communities, language barriers, cultural issues, isolation from family, who may live in the country of origin. It's easier to immigrate to smaller northern communities than large urban cities like Vancouver or Toronto. Rural, remote communities have their own specific issues for immigrant populations. I understand this may not be applicable to the hitchhiking project, which impacts Indigenous women. Thank you for your time today. So there's a good question to have to consider. So we go back to. Yes.
I'm happy to jump in if Danielle doesn't want to go first. I'm happy to go first. In terms of the hitchhiking project, we did actually have 5% of our participants who identified themselves as non-Canadian, so non-Indigenous Canadian, non-Indigenous Canadian and non-Indigenous Canadian. So they identified themselves as something else, essentially. And what that meant was, they could list, but it's a very long list of possibilities there. So we did have immigrants participating in the study, and there are significant numbers of immigrants in Northern BC, including the smallest communities. And there are many immigrants working in the resource extraction industries in the North too. So those, while it might not have been a key theme in the hitchhiking research, that has been a key theme for Northern Fire. And I think for service providers in the North right now, it's something they're talking about very much, because they often don't have the resources to offer services in multiple languages, particularly where you're not getting immigrant communities so much as individual immigrants from multiple origins. So there's not even a logical alternative language of service. So I think, I don't have answers, but certainly we are very alive to this issue in Northern BC.
I would say that for me, it wasn't prominent to interview immigrant women. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for this. I think there's fear around, my connection to these communities was through formal service providers, and, understanding the fear around accessing services depending on status, etc. I think there's likely a disconnect between services and immigrant women in the communities. So I think that's a large part of it. And also, finding someone that they would feel comfortable disclosing what's happening to, and having a common understanding of language and the way way violence is talked about, for example, having a trusting relationship. I think that all feeds into the comfort and willingness to reach out for formal support. But I think there needs to be a lot of education, because often we know that abusers tend to incite fear. Oh, the kids are going to be taken away, you're going to be deported, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of fear built up around accessing services and disclosing what's actually happening. So I think that, speaks to, who's accessing these services, particularly in non-urban communities.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Okay. Another question from Michelle Stevenson. Thanks for the great presentations. Question for Dr. Bader. I'm curious if any of your participants mentioned companion animals and the challenges of finding a safe place for them if needed when searching for safety for themselves from IPV.
That's a great question. It was something I was hoping to explore. I was hoping to at least talk to some women who were owners of farms, and I was not successful in doing that. Surely we know, there's a unique dynamic, particularly, it's a way for abusers to keep women from leaving because they can't just abandon the farm, for example. So, that's a little bit different than companion animals. It didn't come up, like when I think about it, it didn't come up with the women that I spoke to. I'm trying to recall if any of them actually had. I suspect some of them did, and they were, they made arrangements to be able to take them with. But yeah, it wasn't something that really came up for the women, actually, at least the ones I spoke to. But I think it's certainly something that's important to consider moving forward in understanding, what's needed to keep women safer.
I think it's an excellent question for a rural and northern context, because while our shelters here in BC have implemented companion animal housing, that's only for small animals. And women in rural and northern contexts, as Danielle has said, are much more likely to have large animals that are much more difficult to house. So, would you leave your horses with your abuser? Probably not, right? Or your farm animals, as Danielle has said. It's a really important question.
Yes, we may be pursuing that question further with Dr. Stevenson. Yes, other questions? Yes, well, I had one in the interim here to Dr. Bader. Given what we've heard that is in place now with Northern Fire, do you think there's a possibility of something of that sort to emerge or be put into place for the non-urban communities? Or is that something that's a bit, it's not really one or the other, that it might be difficult to organize something of that sort? The network, sorry.
I think it would be interesting. I think really the takeaway from all of the work and through my PhD was really the message that these communities are very unique. And so at what level should these communities band together? And then, at a certain point, do they get too large that they're kind of working against each other? It was interesting for me because, I was nervous going into these communities because, I'm not from the community. I'm asking women about very sensitive topic. And so, I was nervous about not being from the community, but I actually think that was beneficial. So I'm wondering if maybe supports or that kind of thing would be better with those outside of the community that can help in a different way, potentially. I don't know. It could be, the sense I got, I did information sessions, and one of the things that I didn't really expect was women, they all knew they were there for the same reason and they supported each other. So I saw a need for social support for women. So I don't know if it could be something similar to that. I'm not entirely sure, but it's definitely an interesting question.
maybe that the resource guide might be disseminated more widely and have some impact in that regard. I don't know.
I mean, some response I got, I had local resource and it's like, oh, whatever, there's nothing in the community. It doesn't matter. I don't need that. Right. So they feel like there's nowhere to go. There's no one to reach out to. They're kind of on their own. So, I mean, I think it needs to be more than that. I think there needs to be some benefit that they see directly from the work that's being done, or whatever kind of network is put together.
Right, right.
I wonder if there's a big difference in some ways between the two contexts, in that people in northern BC are used to having to be mobile for everything, right? Even their groceries, very often they have to travel long distances to get them. And so maybe there's, transportation is something that can be relatively easily provided and makes a huge difference because they're accustomed to the idea that they have to go a distance to do anything. And so they're more likely, if they can access the transportation, to find a way to get to the services they need. Maybe that's an overly hopeful conjecture on my part, but certainly, we found in the hitchhiking study that one of the big reasons for hitchhiking was to seek social services, including Prince George's shelter system and second stage housing. So I think that transportation, which is very well subscribed now that it exists, transportation for us in this region makes a lot of sense, but maybe not in every region.
Right. Now, isn't it true, you did mention, Jacqueline, the reality that Greyhound services no longer exist? Did that have a notable effect at the time? I remember that was covered in the media, but I'm just thinking that if those kinds of services are lessening, or because that's going to increase vulnerabilities as far as hitchhiking and that sort of highway challenge for the women.
Yeah, the pullout of Greyhound from rural Canada was a major blow. However, the one thing about Greyhound was that it was too expensive for many people. And so to some degree, the service that's replaced it in northern BC is better because it's cheaper. What Greyhound had, though, was frequency. Frequency of service was way better. So what we need is to get the publicly subsidized service, I think, up to that level of previous frequency.
And is predictable as well as in terms of scheduling and that sort of thing, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Right now it's predictable, but so infrequent that, people have to plan, and it breaks your head to actually plan your returns and your, when you're going to get around northern BC, because, this one goes Tuesdays and comes back Fridays, and this one comes back Thursdays but goes Sundays. It's really very complicated and not.
Right.
Really quickly to hop in, Jacqueline, I received a question from someone who had to leave early but was hoping to get it on the recording. They had emailed me. If you could speak a bit more to your globalization study, they said it relates quite a bit to their work.
Oh, to the global context of mobility? Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's really a contextual piece for, I would say, the geographic or mobility oriented portion of the hitchhiking study. So I see that as more contextual. But I think all over the world for the last 2 decades, there's been a huge amount of interest in the way that mobility is gendered. And, in BC, I was just fooling around with some of the most recent data about BC. But if you just look at any jurisdiction and you look at things like car ownership, you can delve into gender differences that have huge impacts on all aspects of life. So that issue of long commuting that I mentioned with regard to masculine cultures, in British Columbia, men are much more likely than women to commute a long distance. That has implications for who's on the northern highways at any given time and who's driving. In BC, men are much more likely to be the driver, women to be the passenger on a regular basis. So as commuters, for example, women are much more likely to be the passengers. So all of those things have implications for vulnerability and not only a sense of safety, but actual safety. Because if you're driving your own car, you're in, I would say, an objectively safer position relative to violence, maybe not relative to motor vehicle accidents, but relative to violence, you're definitely safer than if you're a passenger in someone's car on a long commute. So I think, the global piece is understanding that these issues are situated in a global context in which women's mobility is overall constrained. And it not only makes them more vulnerable to violence, but it makes them less able to access the services they need to protect themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes. And so, actually, another question to Danielle along the same line, and considering now your theoretical contribution that you were speaking about was quite intriguing. And I was just wondering if you have had any uptake, or have you had an opportunity yet to have that model, I call it a model because you have different layers to it as well, as far as the making of meaning of what you found. I was quite intrigued.
I haven't done too much with my dissertation in general since defending. It's something that's on my radar, but life happened and things got busy, but it's certainly something I will endeavor to do in this year. But there has been interest. So after my defense, there was interest in turning my dissertation into a book because of the, keeping the theoretical contribution and understanding how the theories fit together and understanding what's happening in rural communities was notable by my examiners.
Maybe possibly a learning brief before the book, or
I feel like I should say no moving forward. I need to stop saying yes to a lot of things. A
learning brief is brief.
We'll talk about that.
Okay, yes. No pressure. Yes. Okay, any other thoughts? Any in terms of the two of you, do you see how you might certainly I saw commonalities in both the presentations, and where that might go, where that might be drawn into your own research, or that kind of an issue, concern?
I certainly see lots of areas of overlap, and the issue of emotional geography is one that was definitely considered in the hitchhiking study and has been presented internationally. And that, I think, is it's an area of overlap, but it's also so important because perceptions of safety and danger obviously are significant for individuals themselves, but they're also significant for how they deal with situations, how they seek help. And so in Northern BC, if the roads are perceived as a zone of danger, and one's own home, rightly or wrongly, is perceived as more safe, that's going to have implications for willingness to actually take action on a violent situation that exists within the home. So I think, paying attention to those emotional geographies is absolutely critical. And I think I really listened with fascination to that part of the presentation, to all parts of your presentation, Danielle. It was wonderful.
Thank you. No, I found it fascinating with your work as well. Certainly there's overlap in themes, and absolutely transportation was a big issue for both communities. And absolutely, in relation to cost and, what does that mean in terms of, thinking about these women being on social assistance, being on disability. Well, if the bus is going to cost you $60 and you only have 100 and something because you're staying in the shelter, well, how much you have left for the rest of the month, for your other basic needs. And so it really puts women in a position where, they can't get ahead, they can't get a grounding, and it's like, what are they supposed to do? And that you know, you see a lot of women coming in and out of the shelter, the same women, and the options are limited, and it's not a possibility to relocate and all those kinds of things. So it's, you know, even for me, you know, at the end of doing these interviews, it's like you feel helpless, you don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And you see, you know, the service providers, some of them, you know, working around the clock, trying to do the best they can, and, you know, they've maximized what they can do as well. So
Exactly, yes.
Absolutely. And we didn't talk too much about housing, but you know, this was already a wicked problem. And I think the housing situation has made it so much worse right across the country. So we're actually having a conference on the 3rd of March that's focused on housing, homelessness, and transportation, and how those things are impacting women's vulnerability in the North.
it's interesting because there's this common perception that, you know, moving up north is inexpensive compared to being in the city. But, you know, when you think about communities and they've got these dominant industries attracting these high paid workers, that's not the case. And, you know, there's discrimination around low income. They don't want to deal with issues that come with violence and drug use and all those kinds of things. And so they price, you know, low income people out of renting properties. And it's that adds to the complexity of the bigger situation.
Absolutely. So it's become customary up here that you see ads on Facebook that say something like, I'm a pipeliner, I'll pay $2,000 a month and you don't even need to see me. And then you think about someone saying, okay, well, I've got a single mom and her kids, they're willing to pay $1,200 a month and I'll see them, versus this guy who's willing to rent my place and be there 2 nights a week or maybe less.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah,
Interesting.
that's a real challenge.
Wow. For sure. There's another question.
So there was one other thing that came up is quite a few people who work at local legal services very much wanted to attend the webinar, but had conflicts and are eagerly awaiting the recording. So on their behalf, I did want to ask sort of one question that I think would relate to their work, being that if you're looking at this within the context of legal supports and services for survivors, for those living in rural, remote, and northern communities, and obviously that's for those who do come in contact with the formal system, but do you have anything in your research or your work in terms of recommendations for providing better legal support, improving access, those sorts of things?
I can jump in on that. I mean, there is a project in BC that's aimed exactly at doing that, at increasing access to women's legal services, particularly in rural and northern contexts. The only thing I would say about that is that cell coverage and Wi-Fi access become a huge issue for anything that's doing kind of remotely provided services of that kind. And so there's an infrastructure problem right off the bat that needs to be addressed. And the legal services themselves can't do that. But certainly in terms of advocacy, that can be part of the whole package, right? If we're trying to increase women's access to information and services online, then we need them to be able to get online, which in major parts of the North is simply not possible. Or you can get online to check your email, but you couldn't do something like what we're doing right now because your connection won't support it. So infrastructure is critical.
Right. Oh.
I hesitated this question because I know we have training around domestic violence, you know, for judges, etc. But we still see, you know, this problem has been documented for decades at this point in terms of the kind of response we see from these communities, from police, from judges, from justices of the peace. It's still the same mentality. Women are blamed, you know, abusers aren't accountable, etc. It's really understanding the dynamic of what's happening and how that impacts, you know, everyday living. You know, one woman I spoke to, she said, you know, she went to court and the JP said to her, oh, you know, like your file's this big, like, you know, and she says, I know, I've lived every single one of those pages. I didn't just skim the top couple of them, right? And so it's like, it's a total dismissal of the realities of the everyday life of these women, and it's a total slap in the face. And they really need, you know, I think there needs to be an appreciation for how that interaction will impact a woman moving forward. And we know that women, you know, it takes multiple times to leave a partner, et cetera, if that's the appropriate course of action she determines for herself. And so, you know, thinking about how their actions and interactions in these cases are going to impact women moving forward is really critical.
Absolutely.
Right.
If I can add one more thing to that, I think there's also this continuing inattention to non-physical abuse. And I think women themselves know that coercive control puts them at great risk, right? I think they understand that at a level that's very hard to convey to police and to legal authorities, because very often the first question is, well, does he hit you? Right. And so it's almost like if you can't get over that hurdle, nothing's going to happen. And that puts women at great risk when they report.
Exactly. Sounds familiar even down here. But yes, I understand what you're saying. It's amazing. The lack of attention sometimes to those dynamics, coercive control. Okay, I think perhaps we should close now, but I do want to thank both our presenters. It was fascinating, very well presented, and I know it's going to be useful as far as dissemination of what you've done here today, but possibly in the future as well. So I want to thank you very much for taking your time and the effort made to make these presentations. They will have an impact that we're hoping for. So I also should thank our interpreters, Sandra Farley and Violaine Trini, as well as our events coordinator, Amanda, and last but not least, Sarah and Abdul. So with that, I think that we will come to a close unless there are any other closing comments from our presenters.
I just like to say thank you so much for organizing this. Thanks so much to the interpreters as well. Gave them quite a job, I'm sure, but this was a real honor. So thanks to everyone.
Okay, great. All right, well, then we're going to be pressing the buttons at this end. Bye, and thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.